Hi Internet! I wanted to take a moment at the top of the video to say that if you're enjoying the content I'm creating, please feel free to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and also feel free to go into the comments section and leave your thoughts. If you don't like the content I'm creating, that's also perfectly valid. Please feel free to voice any concerns, cries of outrage, critiques in the comment section as well. I'm always looking to become better as a creator, and your comments will really help in that process. Alrighty, so without further ado, let's get on to our topic for the day. And today, we're going to be talking about Scott Pilgrim. Scott Pilgrim is a piece of media that's near and dear to my heart, and when I heard that Netflix was creating an animated series for Scott Pilgrim, I got really excited. I think that an animated series is a great way to tell this story. That being said, Scott Pilgrim is now more than a decade old, and I think it's worth looking back on previous iterations of this story to see what we can potentially look forward to now that this series has been announced. So before we get into the meat and potatoes of Scott Pilgrim, I want to quickly go over my history with Scott Pilgrim to give some context for my opinions as well as my biases. I think that's important just as we progress so that there's context for why I may feel the way that I feel about things. So to start off, when I first saw Scott Pilgrim in theaters, I originally didn't like it. I left the theater and I wasn't terribly impressed, and I think I actually wrote quite a not so nice review on Facebook of the film. It wasn't until a friend of mine in college introduced me to the comics that I really got into Scott Pilgrim. After I read the comics, a bunch of friends on campus were playing Scott Pilgrim the game. After playing the game, I began cosplaying Ramona Flowers regularly at anime conventions. Additionally, I created an Ask IRL Ramona Flowers on Tumblr, which is kind of cringy now looking back at it, but that was another thing that I did because I was really invested in the series. As a result of creating this Tumblr page, there was a GIF of mine that was actually shared with Brian Lee O'Malley by an ex of mine, and I got really hyped. Additionally, in college, there was a lighting project that was given to some of the video students to recreate a scene from Scott Pilgrim. When that happened, the scene was uploaded on YouTube and was actually retweeted by Edgar Wright. All that's to say that Scott Pilgrim became something that was very important to me. Ramona was one of my go-to cosplays at conventions, and a couple of years before I stopped cosplaying was when I stopped cosplaying Ramona. She was one of the core cosplays that I would bring to conventions, and I spent a lot of time in the fandom community surrounding Scott Pilgrim. So now that I've kind of given a top to bottom of how I've interacted and engaged with this media, let's go ahead and get started with the story of Scott Pilgrim. Depending on which piece of media you pick up, you'll get a vaguely different story regarding Scott Pilgrim. The Too Long Didn't Read would be that Scott Pilgrim, who's a local indie soft boy, part of a band who's trying to make it big, develops a crush on the manic pixie dream girl Ramona Flowers, who's recently moved to Toronto to escape her past. That past involves a league of 7 evil exes that Scott Pilgrim must defeat in order to continue dating Ramona. Now, each one of Ramona's evil exes is different and has a different story from dating her. First, we have Matthew Patel, who was Ramona's childhood crush. We don't really know a whole lot about what happened to him afterwards, other than he's a snazzy dresser and has a bunch of demon hipster chicks with him. Next, we have Lucas Lee. Lucas Lee was just sort of a casual relationship that didn't seem to last very long, but he's since gone on to become a super famous movie star. Next, we have Todd Ingram. Todd is a pretty big ex for Ramona, and he's now currently dating one of Scott's exes named Envy, and he is a super-powered vegan rocker who's also pretty famous. Next is Roxy Richter. I'm actually going to table a more detailed explanation into this relationship until later in the video. The reason why is because depending on which piece of media you pick up, you're going to get a very different tone and vibe for the relationship that Ramona and Roxy have. And I think that a more detailed explanation is warranted, so let's table that and talk about it later. Next, we have Kyle and Ken Katayanagi. They are 2 twins who both dated Ramona, not at the same time, but not too far off from each other. And last, we have the big evil ex, Gideon Graves. The one who put the League of Evil Exes together, and the one who's more or less responsible for what's going on with Ramona and why she decided to leave and go to Toronto. We'll get into him later as well, because there's a lot of information surrounding him that, depending on the version of Scott Pilgrim you're interacting with, tells a very different story. So I think that he's also worth tabling until later, just until I can get into the meat and potatoes of that relationship. Now, Ramona might have a League of Evil exes, but Scott also has exes that make appearances in the story as well. The first we have is Kim Pine, who still remains friends with Scott, but their relationship is certainly strained to say the least. Next we have Envy Adams, who is considered Scott's big ex. And depending on which piece of media you're referencing, Envy has a different level of involvement in the story. For example, she's kind of in and out in the movie as well as the game, but she has a more fleshed out character arc in the comics. I find it interesting because Envy becomes a very complex character in the comics, whereas she appears a couple of times in both the movie and the game and then sort of disappears and is never heard from again. And lastly, we have Knives Chow. Knives is Scott's most recent ex, and we're going to get more into this relationship later because honestly it's a little yikes on bikes. I want to get more into what's problematic about Scott Pilgrim a bit later on, because right now I'd like to focus on some of the key differences between the comic, the game, and the movie, just to flesh out the story as we have it so far, so we can look at what potentially is to come with this series. Alright, so let's talk about each iteration. Obviously there are a lot of differences and I'm not going to be able to cover all of them in this video, but let's go over with some broad strokes what the differences are between each piece of media. Each iteration has its own strengths and weaknesses, as the media itself can tell a very different story. So let's start by talking about the movie. I think in the time frame that was allotted, the movie captures the energy of Scott Pilgrim very effectively. I think it goes over the broad strokes of the story that Brian wanted to tell, and I also think that the casting for this movie is absolutely out of this world, especially in 2022. Scott Pilgrim is played by Michael Cera, Ramona Flowers is played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead, Lucas Lee is played by Chris Evans, Wallace Wells is played by Kieran Culkin, Envy Adams is played by Brie Larson, Julie Powers is played by Aubrey Plaza, Gideon Graves is played by Jason Schwartzman, Stacy Pilgrim is played by Anna Kenrick, Kim Pine is played by Allison Pill, and Roxy Richter is played by Mae Whitman. I think it's crazy that back in 2010, all of these people were in the same movie together. That said, they did have to make a lot of changes to the story for the movie. For example, Roxy Richter in the comics actually has a pretty amicable relationship with Ramona, where in the game and in the movie, she's pretty antagonistic and aggressive. Also, Envy becomes less of a character in the movie as well as in the game. A lot of big plot points become little plot points, and also the fight that happens between Ramona and Roxy actually happens between Envy and Ramona in the comic. All in all, it makes sense that they would make these changes though. Because they had to tell a 6-book story in an hour and 52 minutes, there's a lot of stuff that you can't include and you have to change things for it to make sense. That being said, I don't agree with all of the character changes that they made. Next we have the video game. I think that the video game comes a bit closer to the comic in terms of tone. Also, there's an amazing soundtrack by Anamanaguchi that's included throughout the game itself. I think that the format of the game lends itself very well to the storytelling, and I think that it captures the energy of this story extremely well. I think it's really important to say that the game doesn't do a really good job retelling the story if you're not already familiar with its source content. And it's easy to miss some of the plot points if you're not at least a little bit familiar with the comic. I will say that out of all 3 stories though, this portrays Ramona and Scott's relationship the healthiest. I don't think that either of the other 2 iterations describe a particularly healthy relationship between Ramona and Scott, and I think the game makes me more sympathetic to their relationship and makes me root for them a lot more than the other 2 iterations. Now, as I said in the beginning of the video, the comics were what really stood out to me as far as telling this story in an effective way. It really allows us to see how flawed all of the characters are, how human all of the characters are, And I think that it does a really good job not making them necessarily the best people, but making them people that you're still invested in learning more about. Now, there's a lot of stuff in the comics that didn't quite make it into the film. For example, in the comics, Stephen Stills is gay. He's in a relationship with the person who's recording the tracks for Scott and Stephen's band, and they develop a relationship which is used as a point to bring up how Scott isn't as involved with his friends because he's in a relationship with him for a period of time and Scott just kind of doesn't notice. Additionally, we get more context for Kim and Scott's relationship in the comics. Although they talk about it a little bit in the movie, Kim and Scott in high school dated, and Scott wasn't exactly the best person. The way he remembers it is that he was a hero who saved Kim from this big baddie at his high school, but the way that Kim remembers it is that he kind of just beat up this kid so that he could be in a relationship with her and was kind of not a great person. I think it's really interesting and gives a lot more context for Scott as a character because we're seeing his past from more than one perspective, and we're getting that sense of self-awareness closer to the end of the comics because he has to reconcile other people's interpretations of the past rather than relying solely on his own. Next, one of the big differences is Envy Adams. Like I said earlier, Envy in both the game and the movie is kind of there and then just kind of disappears. Whereas in the comic, she appears initially in book 3, gets into a battle with Ramona, and then reappears later in book 6 to continue with Scott's path towards understanding himself. She's also performing at the Chaos Theater during the final battle between Gideon and Scott. She also seems to be a lot more sympathetic to Scott towards the end of the comic, and all in all, it seems that their relationship ends a bit more amicably than it does in any of the other iterations. One of the other things that changes pretty consistently from media to media is the portrayal of Nega Scott. Nega Scott in the movie just kind of appears and then disappears. He's not really a super big part of the movie. Whereas in the game, he's someone that you have to battle in order to move forward. In the comic, he really acts as a foil for Scott's ability to develop a sense of self-awareness. It's when he's confronting Nega Scott that Scott actually recognizes how much he's hurt other people and how much the story he tells himself about his past may not be everyone else's experience. I think Nega Scott in the comics does a really good job of rounding out Scott's journey towards self-awareness, whereas he didn't really need to be there in the movie, and in the game, I guess he can be there, but it's more so just another boss on your way to Gideon. It doesn't really seem like there's a real purpose for him to be there. Next is the character of Lisa Miller. If you haven't read the comics, you probably don't know who I'm talking about. She's briefly mentioned during the party scene in the movie when Julie is listing off different girls that Scott's been in a relationship with in the past. But that being said, they were never truly in a relationship according to the comics, and in the game she's sort of just in the background. In the comics, she acts as this long-lost love that Scott has, this maybe we should have, been in a relationship before they finally reconcile that the two of them should never be in a relationship together and they work way better as friends. This happens in the book that involves Roxy Richter, and it works as a great contrast against Ramona's relationship with Roxy. In the comic, Ramona and Roxy are on really good terms, and Roxy actually stays over at Ramona's house. And Lisa appears in the comic right around this time and sort of acts as this character who's potentially going to reignite an old flame, and both Ramona and Scott find their way back to each other and decide that they want to continue on in their relationship at the end of it all. It makes sense that Lisa wouldn't be as prominent in the game as well as in the movie because she's not a super crucial character to telling this story. While I do like her inclusion and I do like what she offers to the story, she's not necessary for us to move forward with the story of Scott Pilgrim. And lastly, depending on which piece of media you pick up, it's going to change just how evil Gideon Graves is. I'm going to get into that in more detail because I think it's worth fleshing out just how different each of the iterations are regarding the evilness of Gideon's character. So let's talk about why Gideon is so different depending on the adaptation. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the movie, production began in 2007. This is before Brian Lee O'Malley had started working on Scott Pilgrim's Final Hour, which is the last comic. While he did provide some notes regarding what he had planned, ultimately the ending that was provided in the film was considered the ending written by the production rather than Brian Lee O'Malley himself. He was involved in production of the movie, but the ending was not quite what he had envisioned. Some ideas for the film that were cut before production included Scott turning out to be a serial killer who fantasized about the gaming aspects, and that Gideon would turn into a Transformers-style robot at the end. Now, with production for the film beginning in roughly 2007, it's also important to look at the other dates in which things were completed. For example, the game was released in the summer of 2009, and in February of 2009, Brian Lee O'Malley was pretty conclusive on what he wanted to do for the final comic. Now let's talk about Gideon in the movie. Gideon in the movie is just not a good guy, but I would say he's the tamest out of all the iterations of Gideon. He's running the Chaos Theater, he's being pompous, he's just kind of not the best dude. He's one of those flaunty, one-uppy types and ends up beating Scott pretty quickly in the first round. It isn't until we learn Gideon has put a mind control chip on Ramona's neck that we actually start to see a little bit of villainy from him, I would say. And then he goes full villain when he kicks Ramona down a flight of stairs, which enrages both Scott and Knives to beat him up. I would say that Gideon in this iteration is a pretty tame final villain in comparison to what we get in both the game and the comics. That being said, I think Jason Schwartzman does a fantastic job with this role. I just personally prefer Gideon in both the game and the comic. In the game, I think Gideon comes close to what he is in the comics without being a direct copy. Gideon is a 3-stage boss battle where you first fight him upon entering the Chaos Theater, where Gideon turns into this rage monster and then attacks Scott. Next, you fight Gideon as a big baddie in subspace, where he's an amalgamation of all 7 evil X's. And lastly, you have a final battle with Gideon where you realize it's been a simulation and then you finally take him head on and destroy the Chaos Theater. Alright, so let's get into who Gideon is in the comics. Hey guys, it's Editing Chris. I wanted to quickly jump in because I realized that I did a pretty bad job when filming explaining why Gideon is so much more sinister in the comics, so wanted to quickly come in, give some context, and go over some of his greatest hits. So in book 3, we see that Gideon is stalking Ramona and Scott, and at the end of book 5, Gideon gives Scott a phone call and taunts him a bit and then asks when it would be a convenient time for him to die. Scott spends the beginning of book 6 paralyzed at the idea of having to fight Gideon. When he enters the Chaos Theater, one of the first things that Gideon does when he starts fighting him is steal the power of love, which Scott acquires in book 4 in the comics, out from his chest, and then starts fighting him with it, later stabbing him with it, and then stabbing Ramona with it. And of course, Gideon has a freezer full of his ex-girlfriends that he keeps, that he intends to add Ramona to once they get back in a relationship together. Thank you guys for being so understanding of this quickly added in recap. I think it's important to highlight these events to really talk about how much more sinister he is in the comics. He's really not a good dude. I'm going to hand it back on over to Filming Chris to continue covering Gideon in the comic in more detail. In the comic, it's less clear if Ramona is actually fully done with Gideon as well. She names her cat Gideon, and she also has these spicy feelings about him that we're privy to in book 4, which come full circle at the end of book 6. I also think that this has the strongest ending because canonically, Ramona and Scott defeat Gideon together using the power of love and the power of understanding. Whereas in the movie, it's Knives and Scott who defeat Gideon, but mainly Scott. And In the game, it's really whoever you pick. All in all, I also think that the different iterations offer a different tone. That being said, there are some universal yikes to each of these stories that I think are really important to cover, and that's what we're going to get into now. So let's talk about the cringe and the yikes of Scott Pilgrim. Brian Lee O'Malley, I believe at one point stated that this story isn't about good people and it's about cool people and how they aren't always good people. That's pretty apparent throughout the story of Scott Pilgrim, and there are things that I'd like to address as things that hopefully could potentially change as we're looking at a series in the future. I would say one of the biggest cringy, yikesy moments for me personally is the fact that Knives Chow is 17 and in high school. I don't think this really adds anything to the story. I think that it's kind of yikesy on a deeper level, and I think especially in 2022, this is something that can really just go as far as a story element is concerned. I don't really like the fetishizing that goes on with knives in general. I don't think it adds anything. I think it's kind of gross that they refer to her as Scott's fake high school girlfriend. It's really something that I hope does change for the series, because it's always something that hasn't quite sat well with me. Whether it's been reading the comics or watching the movie, it was just always something that I didn't feel comfortable with. Next, I'd like to briefly touch on the dismissal of queerness in Scott Pilgrim. I could probably make a whole video about this, but I'm just going to be really brief and say that I don't like the way that they minimize and dismissed Ramona's and Roxy's relationship and kind of minimized it to this just a phase, wasn't a valid or legitimate relationship. I'm also not super keen on Wallace coming in and stealing all of Stacy Pilgrim's boyfriends in Scott Pilgrim the movie, and I'm also not a huge fan of how queerness in general is sort of dismissed or is kind of an afterthought. I think that this is something that a series could definitely correct and set right, and I'm hopeful that that's what we're going to see in the future. The next thing is, I think, a little bit more controversial, which is the "I'm in lesbians with you" line. That was the line that I heard pretty much everybody say from Scott Pilgrim, and I get it. I guess at the time it was pretty funny, maybe, but I personally don't like it. I'd really appreciate it if maybe we could update that. I don't know. I'm just not a huge fan of that, and that's just me personally offering my hot take. I think that it can just go and we can find something funnier. And lastly, I'd just like to briefly touch on the Katayanagi twins. I'm not a huge fan of that relationship in general. I know that at this point it's sort of a pillar of Scott Pilgrim, and I know Ramona's not a good person, but that whole relationship was a little bit yikesy to me. I know that she dated them separately, but it's still a little gross, and I'm not a huge fan of it, so I know that this is kind of just a complaint, and maybe I'm in the minority here, but that was a relationship that always sort of rubbed me the wrong way. There's probably more cringy and yikesy things that I've missed in this discussion, but those are the big four that I wanted to touch on. Those are the four things that stood out to me kind of across the 3 different iterations that we currently have. And while I don't anticipate any of these things changing, these are the 4 things that kind of never sat right with me in the story, and I'm interested to see how they're going to tackle these in 2022. So what do we know so far? So Netflix and UCP are developing the series, and Brian Lee O'Malley is writing and executive producing, with Ben Grabinski as the showrunner. He's also the showrunner of the Are You Afraid of the Dark revival. Science Saru is going to be animating, and currently we don't know if it's going to be a 100% faithful adaptation or if things are going to be changed. I'm curious to see the way that things are going to be handled with this series. I understand that it is something that is a product of its time, for sure, but it'll be interesting to see if some things are changed for 2022, if maybe some of the problematic elements that don't quite fly nowadays are changed, or if they're going to stay faithful to the source material. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. In conclusion, even though there's a lot of yikes and cringe moments throughout the course of the story of Scott Pilgrim, I also think there are a lot of relatable characters within the series. Relationships are a part of the fabric of human life, and I think Scott Pilgrim tells a messy love story between two imperfect people. I think it's very human, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we get with the upcoming iteration of Scott Pilgrim as an animated series. Who knows, maybe I'll make another video when it drops reviewing it. Alright, well, now that I've talked your ear off, I think it's time for us to close. Thank you for watching the video. Like I said at the beginning, please feel free to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and also leave a comment down below voicing your thoughts and opinions. If you didn't enjoy the video, also feel free to use the comment section to provide critique, cries of outrage. Any feedback that you provide is valid and I deeply appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you in the next video, and I will talk to you soon.